The rain fell in icy sheets that November night, turning the narrow forest path into a treacherous river of mud. But Rosalind Gray did not stop running. Her wedding gown, once pristine ivory silk that had taken 3 seamstresses a month to complete, now hung in tatters around her ankles, the delicate lace torn by thorns and branches that had clawed at her like grasping fingers trying to pull her back to the fate she had escaped. Her lungs burned with each gasping breath. Her heart hammered so violently against her ribs that she feared it might shatter, but still she ran, because the alternative was unthinkable. Behind her, somewhere in the darkness of her uncle's estate, Lord Percival Thornton would have discovered by now that his bride had vanished from the locked chamber where she had been kept like a prisoner awaiting execution, and he would be furious. The man she had been sold to in marriage, the man whose first 2 wives had died under mysterious circumstances, that society whispered about but never investigated, would not forgive this humiliation. Her uncle, who had gambled away the family fortune and saw her as nothing more than a debt to be paid, would be equally enraged. But as Rosalind stumbled through the forest, her slippers long since lost to the mud, her bare feet bleeding and numb with cold, she knew with absolute certainty that she would rather die free in these woods than live as Lady Thornton. The abandoned gamekeeper's cottage appeared through the darkness like a miracle, a small stone structure with a sagging roof and broken shutters that spoke of years of neglect. Rosalind had heard the servants at her uncle's house mention it once, whispering that it sat on the border of the Duke of Ravenmore's lands, a place so remote and forgotten that even the gamekeeper who once lived there had abandoned it a decade ago. It was perfect. With trembling hands she pushed open the warped wooden door, wincing at the creak of ancient hinges, and stumbled into the musty interior. Moonlight filtered through gaps in the roof, illuminating a single room with a cold fireplace, a broken chair, and a pile of rotting straw that might once have been a bed. It was the most beautiful sight Rosalind had ever seen. She collapsed onto the filthy floor, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion, and for the first time since her uncle had informed her of the arranged marriage 3 months ago, she allowed herself to weep. Not delicate tears of a lady, but great shaking sobs of relief and terror and grief for the life she had lost, for the family who had betrayed her, for the future that now stretched before her, as uncertain as the storm-dark sky. 3 days passed in that cottage, 3 days during which Rosalind lived on rainwater, collected in a cracked clay pot, and the half-loaf of bread she had stolen from the kitchen during her escape. She kept the shutters closed during daylight, terrified that a passing rider might see smoke from a fire or movement within and investigate. At night, she ventured out to forage for berries and roots, anything to quiet the gnawing hunger that made her light-headed and weak. She knew this could not last. Winter was approaching, and already the November air carried the sharp promise of frost. Without proper food, without warm clothing, without any means of survival, she would not live to see spring. But what choice did she have? To return meant death of a different kind, a slow suffocation of spirit as she became Lady Thornton, subject to a man whose cold eyes had looked at her on their one formal meeting, as though she were livestock he was purchasing. No, better to freeze in this forgotten cottage than to live as his possession. On the 4th morning, as pale dawn light crept through the cracks in the shutters, Rosalind heard the sound that would change everything. Hoofbeats approaching through the forest, steady and deliberate, the gait of a horse whose rider knew exactly where he was going. Her heart lurched into her throat. She pressed herself against the wall beside the door, barely breathing, praying that whoever it was would pass by. But the hoofbeats stopped directly outside the cottage. There was a long, terrible moment of silence, and then came the knock. 3 sharp raps against the ancient wood, each one like a judge's gavel sealing her fate. A man's voice followed, deep and cold and absolutely certain of its own authority, cutting through the morning air with the precision of a blade. The Duke of Ravenmore, the most powerful and feared nobleman in 3 counties, the man whose lands she had trespassed upon, had found her. And from the tone of his voice, from the controlled anger that thrummed beneath each carefully enunciated word, Rosalind knew that her desperate flight from one prison might have delivered her directly into another. The door did not open immediately, and for a heartbeat Julian Ashcroft, Duke of Ravenmore, considered the absurdity of standing outside a ruined cottage on his own land, waiting for permission to enter, from whoever had dared to make it their hiding place. His steward had reported smoke from the old gamekeeper's cottage 2 nights ago, and Julian had dismissed it as poachers or vagrants who would move on quickly enough. But when the smoke continued, when his morning ride brought him past this forgotten corner of his estate, and he saw the broken shutters pulled carefully closed, saw the faint footprints in the mud leading to and from the door, he knew this was no ordinary trespasser. Someone was living here, hiding here and on Julian's land, that made it his business and his problem. He had lost count of the responsibilities that pressed down upon him since inheriting the dukedom at 23, since losing his wife Catherine to a fever 2 years later, since becoming both father and mother to his daughter Marianne, who was now 7 years old, and growing up in a house haunted by grief and silence. The last thing he needed was complications, and a hidden resident in his forest promised exactly that. When the door finally opened, Julian found himself looking down at a young woman who defied every expectation he had formed. She was not a vagrant or a poacher's wife. Despite the filth and tatters, despite the hollow cheeks and wild eyes, despite the mud-caked hair that might once have been a rich chestnut brown, she carried herself with a dignity that spoke of gentle birth, of a life that had once included dancing lessons and watercolor painting and all the useless accomplishments society demanded of its daughters. But it was her eyes that arrested him, large and grey as winter storms, meeting his gaze with a strange mixture of defiance and terror that stirred something in his chest he thought he had buried with Catherine. This was no common thief. This was a lady in hiding, and that meant scandal, complications, and involvement in affairs that a wise man would walk away from immediately. Julian Ashcroft had not become one of the most powerful men in England by being foolish. He should turn around, ride back to Ravenmore Hall, and send his steward to deal with this situation. But even as the thought formed, he knew he would not. Because in that moment, looking at this woman who stood in the doorway of his forgotten cottage like a queen defending her castle, despite having nothing but pride and desperation, Julian made a decision that would unravel the carefully controlled life he had built and force him to feel again whether he wanted to or not. 2 months before that rain-soaked night, when Rosalind Gray fled through the forest in her wedding gown, she had been sitting in her uncle's drawing room, embroidering a handkerchief with yellow roses, when her entire world collapsed with a single sentence. Her uncle, Mr. Edmund Gray, a man whose fondness for cards and brandy had grown in direct proportion to his dwindling fortune, had entered the room with the satisfied expression of someone who had just solved a particularly vexing problem. He informed her with no preamble and less sympathy that he had arranged her marriage to Lord Percival Thornton, a wealthy viscount of 52 years, whose estate in Yorkshire would provide the funds necessary to settle Edmund's considerable gambling debts. The wedding would take place in 8 weeks, and Rosalind's opinions on the matter were neither requested nor relevant. She had sat there, needle suspended in mid-air, watching a drop of blood well up where the point had pricked her finger, and felt the future she had imagined, modest though it had been, dissolve like morning mist. Rosalind had been living with her uncle since her parents died of scarlet fever, when she was 16, and in the 5 years since, she had made herself as invisible and useful as possible, hoping that her quiet competence in managing his household and her frugal habits would earn her a place of safety. She had no fortune, no particular beauty to recommend her, and no influential connections to secure her a good match. Her plan had been simple: remain in her uncle's household as an unpaid companion and housekeeper, and perhaps eventually find a position as a governess where she might have independence, if not comfort. It was not the life of balls and courtship she had once dreamed of as a girl, but it was honest and it was hers. But Edmund Gray had other plans for his niece, plans that involved selling her like a mare at auction to the highest bidder willing to overlook her lack of dowry in exchange for youth and the ability to produce heirs. The weeks that followed were a nightmare of wedding preparations that felt like funeral arrangements. Rosalind made quiet inquiries about Lord Thornton among the servants, who were always more willing to share truth than their masters, and what she learned turned her blood cold. His first wife had fallen down the stairs and broken her neck after only 6 months of marriage. His second wife had wasted away from a mysterious illness that the physicians could not diagnose, dying after 2 years of marriage, during which the servants reported hearing screams from the locked bedroom at night. There were rumors of cruelty, of a violent temper hidden beneath aristocratic manners, of a man who viewed women as possessions to be used and discarded. When Rosalind attempted to share these concerns with her uncle, he had struck her across the face, the first and only time he had ever raised his hand to her, and told her that beggars could not be choosers, and that she should be grateful any man of quality would take a penniless orphan with no prospects. The night before her wedding, locked in her chamber as a precaution against any foolish thoughts of rebellion, Rosalind had made her decision. She would rather face starvation, exposure, or death in the wilderness than place herself in the hands of Lord Percival Thornton. She used a hairpin to pick the lock, a skill she had learned from a maid years ago during a game, and had never imagined she would need. She took only what she could carry: the bread from her untouched dinner tray, a shawl, and the small silver locket containing portraits of her parents that was her only inheritance. Then she had climbed out the window, down the trellis, and run into the storm-dark night, leaving behind the name Miss Rosalind Grey and everything it represented. Now standing in the doorway of the gamekeeper's cottage, facing the Duke of Ravenmore, whose reputation for cold efficiency and intolerance of anything that disrupted the perfect order of his domain was legendary throughout the county, Rosalind understood that her flight might have been for nothing. The Duke stood before her like judgment incarnate, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair touched with silver at the temples, though he could not be more than 35, his eyes the color of winter ice, his expression revealing absolutely nothing of his thoughts. He was dressed for riding in impeccably tailored clothes that probably cost more than her uncle's annual income, and he looked at her with the detached assessment of a man examining a problematic piece of property that required disposal. Rosalind lifted her chin and met his gaze, determined that if this was to be the end of her brief freedom, she would face it with dignity, because dignity was all she had left. Julian Ashcroft did not believe in charity, sentiment, or involving himself in the messy complications of other people's lives, which was precisely why the decision he made in that moment baffled him even as he heard himself speaking the words. He informed the young woman that she was trespassing on private property, that he could have her arrested and returned to whoever she was running from, but that he was prepared to offer an alternative. Ravenmore Hall required a temporary governess for his daughter Marianne, whose previous governess had departed suddenly to care for an ailing mother. And if this woman was indeed gently bred as her bearing suggested, she could fill the position until a permanent replacement was found. In exchange, she would receive room, board, and his protection from whatever scandal or danger she was fleeing, with no questions asked about her past. It was a business arrangement, nothing more, and it would expire when he secured a proper governess from London. The woman had stared at him with those storm-grey eyes that seemed to see straight through his carefully constructed indifference, and then she had accepted with a simple nod, understanding as clearly as he did that this was not generosity but a transaction, and that she had no other choice. The carriage ride to Ravenmore Hall passed in uncomfortable silence, with Rosalind perched on the edge of the seat as though afraid to soil the fine velvet upholstery with her ruined dress, and Julian pretending to review correspondence while covertly observing his unexpected guest. She held herself with rigid control, hands folded in her lap, gaze fixed on the passing landscape, revealing nothing of her thoughts or fears. It was a performance he recognized intimately because he had perfected it himself in the 2 years since Catherine's death, this armor of composure that kept the world at a safe distance. When they arrived at the hall, a magnificent estate of grey stone that had housed the Dukes of Ravenmore for 3 centuries, Julian watched her face for the reaction of awe or calculation that usually appeared when people first saw his wealth and power. But she simply looked at the building with the same careful blankness she had maintained throughout the journey, and he found himself oddly frustrated by her refusal to react, to give him any insight into who she really was beneath the mud and mystery. The housekeeper, Mrs. Blackwood, a woman who had served the Ashcroft family for 40 years and possessed the terrifying efficiency of a general commanding troops, took charge of Rosalind with brisk professionalism that barely concealed her disapproval of this irregular arrangement. She whisked the bedraggled young woman away to the servants' quarters, muttering about hot baths and decent clothing and the impropriety of His Grace bringing home strays like a boy with a wounded bird. Julian retreated to his study, poured himself a measure of brandy he did not truly want, and tried to understand why he had done something so monumentally foolish. He could have sent her to the village with a few coins and been done with the matter. He could have contacted the authorities and let them handle whatever trouble she was fleeing. Instead, he had brought her into his home, given her access to his daughter, and promised protection without even knowing her full name or the nature of her circumstances. The answer, though he would not admit it even to himself, was that for one brief moment when she had stood in that doorway, meeting his gaze with defiant desperation, he had seen something that called to the part of himself he thought he had successfully buried with his wife. Catherine's betrayal, discovered only after her death when he found letters revealing a long affair with his former friend, had taught him that trust was a luxury he could not afford, and that love was simply a pleasant lie people told themselves before reality arrived. He had rebuilt his life around duty, responsibility, and emotional isolation, creating a perfectly ordered existence where nothing unexpected could wound him. And yet here was this woman, this Miss Grey as she had finally introduced herself with obvious reluctance, disrupting that order simply by existing, by looking at him as though she understood exactly what he was hiding, because she was hiding something equally profound herself. That evening, when Rosalind was presented to Marianne in the nursery, scrubbed clean and dressed in a simple grey gown borrowed from one of the maids, Julian watched from the doorway as his daughter, who had barely spoken more than monosyllables to anyone since her mother's death, took the strange woman's hand without hesitation and asked if she knew any stories about princesses who saved themselves. Rosalind had knelt down to Marianne's level, smiled with genuine warmth that transformed her entire face from merely pretty to luminous, and replied that she knew many such stories because she was living one herself. In that moment, watching his daughter's eyes light up with interest for the first time in months, Julian realized with something approaching panic that bringing this woman into Ravenmore Hall might have been the most dangerous decision he had ever made, because she had the power to make them both hope again. And hope was the cruelest thing you could give to people who had learned that happiness was always temporary, and loss was the only certain. The weeks that followed established a routine that felt both comfortable and dangerous in its growing intimacy, though Julian would have denied the latter with vehement conviction. Rosalind proved to be everything a governess should be: patient, educated, creative in her teaching methods, and possessed of a natural warmth that drew Marianne out of the shell of silence she had inhabited since losing her mother. The child who had refused to take lessons or speak in complete sentences now chatted excitedly about the history lessons Miss Grey made come alive with stories, about the arithmetic problems presented as puzzles to solve, about the watercolor paintings they created together each afternoon. Julian found himself inventing excuses to pass by the schoolroom, to observe these lessons from the hallway, telling himself he was simply ensuring his daughter's education was proceeding appropriately, while knowing the truth was far more complicated. He was drawn to the sound of Rosalind's laughter, to the gentle way she spoke to Marianne, to the glimpses of the intelligent, spirited woman beneath the careful governess demeanor she maintained in his presence. But it was the evenings that truly undid his carefully maintained distance, those hours after Marianne was asleep, when proper protocol dictated that Miss Grey should remain in her quarters, yet somehow she kept appearing in places where their paths would cross. She would be in the library selecting books for tomorrow's lessons when he came to retrieve a volume on estate management. She would be walking in the garden at twilight when he took his nightly constitutional to clear his mind. She would be sitting in the music room, playing the pianoforte with surprising skill, filling the house with melodies that had been silent since Catherine's death. At first, their conversations were brief and formal, discussions of Marianne's progress or requests for supplies for the schoolroom. But gradually, almost against his will, Julian found himself lingering, asking her opinions on matters that had nothing to do with his daughter's education, discovering that beneath her careful reserve was a mind as sharp as any he had encountered in London's finest drawing rooms, and a perspective on the world that challenged his own assumptions in ways he found both irritating and exhilarating. It was during one such evening encounter in the library, 6 weeks after her arrival, that the carefully maintained boundaries between them began to crack. Rosalind had been searching for a book on Greek mythology when she had accidentally dislodged a heavy volume from a high shelf, and Julian had caught it before it could strike her, his hands closing around the leather binding at the same moment hers did, their fingers touching in a contact that lasted perhaps 2 seconds, but felt like an eternity. They had both frozen, standing too close in the narrow space between the shelves, and for one breathless moment, Julian had seen in her eyes the same awareness that was coursing through his own veins, this recognition that what existed between them had progressed far beyond the professional relationship of employer and governess. She had withdrawn first, stepping back with a murmured apology and a flush rising in her cheeks, but the damage was done. Julian could no longer pretend that his interest in Miss Grey was merely concern for his daughter's welfare or idle curiosity about her mysterious past. The crisis came, as these things always do, when Julian least expected it and was least prepared to handle it. Lord Thornton himself appeared at Ravenmore Hall one December morning, arriving in a carriage bearing his coat of arms and demanding an audience with the Duke on a matter of urgent importance. Julian received him in his study, noting with distaste the man's florid complexion, the cruel set of his mouth and the possessive anger that radiated from him as he explained that his runaway bride, Miss Rosalind Grey, had been traced to this vicinity and that he had reason to believe she might be sheltering on Ravenmore land. He had every legal right to reclaim his betrothed, he insisted, as their marriage contract had been signed and witnessed, making her as good as his wife in the eyes of the law. He expected the Duke's cooperation in locating and returning his property, and he would be most displeased if he discovered that anyone had been harboring the ungrateful girl who had caused him such embarrassment. Julian sat behind his massive oak desk, his face revealing nothing of the cold fury that had ignited in his chest at hearing Rosalind referred to as property, at understanding exactly what kind of man she had been fleeing when she stumbled into that gamekeeper's cottage. Every instinct screamed at him to throw Thornton out of his house and damn the consequences, but years of political maneuvering and strategic thinking held him in check. He informed Lord Thornton with Arctic courtesy that he was unaware of any Miss Grey on his property, that Ravenmore land was extensive and impossible to monitor completely, but that if such a person were discovered, he would of course notify the proper authorities. It was a carefully worded lie that committed him to nothing while buying time, and Thornton had no choice but to accept it and depart, though his parting look promised that this matter was far from settled. The moment the carriage disappeared down the drive, Julian went directly to the schoolroom, where Rosalind was teaching Marianne about the constellations, and with 2 words shattered the fragile peace they had all been living in. He told her simply that Lord Thornton had come, that he knew she was in the area, and that they needed to talk about what happened next, because the decision he made in the hours ahead would determine whether he remained the cold, controlled Duke of Ravenmore, who protected his own interests above all else, or whether he became the man who fought for a woman he was absolutely not supposed to love. That night, after Marianne had been put to bed and the household had settled into sleep, Julian found Rosalind exactly where he expected her to be, in the library, staring out the window at the winter darkness, her posture rigid with the tension of someone preparing to run again. She turned when she heard his footsteps, and the expression on her face, resignation mixed with a bone-deep weariness that made her look far older than her years, struck him like a physical blow. She began to speak, to offer the apologies and explanations he had not asked for, to thank him for his kindness, and assure him she would leave at first light to spare him any further involvement in her troubles. But Julian raised a hand to silence her, crossed the room in 3 long strides, and did something he had not done in the 2 years since Catherine's death. He allowed himself to be honest about what he was feeling. He told Rosalind that he knew about Lord Thornton's reputation, that he had made inquiries after the man's visit, and learned things that had made his blood run cold, that he understood exactly what kind of fate she had been fleeing, and that he would see himself damned before he allowed her to be dragged back to it. The words spilled out of him with an intensity that shocked them both, years of carefully controlled emotion breaking through the dam he had built around his heart. He told her about Catherine, about the perfect marriage that had been nothing but performance and lies, about discovering after her death that she had been having an affair with his closest friend, that she had confessed everything in a letter meant to be read only if she died, as though death would absolve her of the responsibility of facing him with the truth. He spoke of how that betrayal had hollowed him out, had made him retreat behind walls of duty and distance, because if he could not trust the woman he had loved more than life itself, then trust was simply another illusion, and love another word for eventual pain. He explained that he had brought Rosalind to Ravenmore Hall, intending to keep her at arm's length, to maintain the professional boundaries appropriate between a duke and a governess, to protect himself from any possibility of caring again. But she had made that impossible, he confessed, because she had shown him through her every action what real integrity looked like, what quiet courage meant, what it was to value honor over comfort and dignity over survival. Rosalind listened to this confession with tears streaming silently down her face, and when he finally fell silent, his own eyes burning with emotions he had forbidden himself to feel, she crossed the distance between them and took his hands in hers. She told him her own truth then, the words tumbling out in a rush as though a dam had broken in her as well. She spoke of the loneliness of being unwanted by the only family she had left, of the humiliation of being sold like cattle to settle debts she had not incurred, of the terror she had felt looking into Lord Thornton's eyes and seeing her own death reflected there. She confessed that the weeks at Ravenmore Hall had been the happiest of her life, not because of the safety or comfort he had provided, though she was grateful for both, but because for the first time since her parents died, she had felt seen, valued, treated as though her thoughts and feelings mattered. She admitted that she had fallen in love with him, despite knowing it was foolish and hopeless, despite understanding that a penniless governess with a scandalous past could never be anything more to a duke than a temporary responsibility. The kiss that followed was inevitable, a collision of two people who had been denying what existed between them for weeks, and it shattered the last of Julian's careful control. He held her as though she were something precious and fragile that might disappear if he loosened his grip, and she clung to him with equal desperation, and for those few stolen moments in the darkened library, they were not a duke and a governess, but simply two wounded people who had found in each other the possibility of healing. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, both shaken by the intensity of what had passed between them, Julian made a decision that was either the bravest or most foolish thing he had ever done. He told Rosalind that he would not allow Lord Thornton to take her, that he would fight the man's claim through every legal means available, that he would use every ounce of his power and influence to protect her. But more than that, he told her with a certainty that surprised even himself, he intended to make her his duchess, to marry her and give her the protection of his name and title, to claim her publicly before all of society, so that no one, not Thornton nor her uncle nor anyone else, could ever threaten her again. Rosalind protested immediately, arguing that such a marriage would ruin him socially, that the scandal of a duke marrying a runaway bride with no fortune or family would make him a laughingstock, that she could not allow him to sacrifice his reputation for her sake. But Julian silenced her objections with another kiss, and then with words that came from a place deeper than reason or caution. He told her that he had spent 2 years living as a ghost in his own life, going through the motions of duty without joy or purpose, and that she had reminded him what it meant to truly live, to feel, to hope. He said that society's opinion meant nothing compared to the prospect of losing her, that his reputation would survive the scandal far better than his soul would survive letting her go. He explained that Marianne needed her, needed the warmth and love she brought into their cold and lonely house, and that he needed her just as much, though it had taken him far too long to admit it. He promised that he would make the announcement at the Winter Ball in 3 weeks' time, the most important social event of the season, where every titled family in 3 counties would be gathered. There, before the very society that had allowed men like Lord Thornton to prey on vulnerable women, he would claim Rosalind Grey as his intended bride and dare anyone to question his choice. The 3 weeks that followed were a strange mixture of anticipation and dread, as Julian set his plan into motion with the strategic precision of a general preparing for battle. He consulted with his solicitors about the legality of Lord Thornton's claim, discovering to his grim satisfaction that a marriage contract could be contested on grounds of coercion, and that an unconsummated betrothal had far less legal weight than Thornton had implied. He sent discreet inquiries to Yorkshire, hiring investigators to document the circumstances surrounding the deaths of Thornton's previous wives, gathering evidence that would destroy the man's reputation if he attempted to press his claim publicly. He met with influential friends in Parliament, making it quietly known that any man who supported Thornton's cause would find himself on the opposite side of the Duke of Ravenmore on every political matter going forward. It was a campaign of careful manipulation and strategic pressure, using every tool of power and influence at his disposal, and Julian prosecuted it with cold efficiency, even as his heart raced with an emotion he barely recognized as fear, because he understood that for all his wealth and title, he could not control how society would react to his unprecedented choice of bride. Rosalind spent those same weeks in a state of anxious limbo, torn between hope and terror, wanting desperately to believe that Julian's plan would work, while unable to silence the voice that whispered she was being foolish to trust in fairy tale endings. She continued her duties as Marianne's governess, finding solace in the child's uncomplicated affection and the routine of lessons that kept her mind occupied. But the nights were harder, filled with dreams of Lord Thornton's cruel eyes and her uncle's contemptuous voice, with visions of the winter ball ending not in triumph, but in humiliation, as society rejected Julian's scandalous proposal and she was dragged away in disgrace. Julian seemed to sense these fears even when she tried to hide them, appearing at odd moments throughout the day to offer quiet reassurance, a touch of his hand on her shoulder, a look that promised he would not abandon her no matter what came. It was during these stolen moments of connection, brief conversations in the hallway or silent companionship in the library, that Rosalind began to truly believe that perhaps she deserved this happiness, that perhaps her value was not determined by her lack of fortune or family, but by the qualities Julian had seen in her from the beginning, the strength and integrity that no amount of poverty or persecution could diminish. Mrs. Blackwood, who missed nothing that happened in Ravenmore Hall, had discerned the true nature of the relationship between her employer and the governess within days of Julian's decision, and her initial disapproval had gradually transformed into grudging support. She had served the Ashcroft family long enough to remember when the current Duke had been a laughing boy before duty, and betrayal had turned him cold, and she recognized that Miss Grey had accomplished what no one else could. She had brought him back to life. The housekeeper took it upon herself to prepare Rosalind for the winter ball, overseeing the creation of a gown that would announce to society that this was no mere governess, but a woman worthy of becoming a duchess. The dressmaker was sworn to secrecy and worked day and night to create a masterpiece in deep sapphire silk that brought out the grey of Rosalind's eyes with delicate silver embroidery that caught the light like stars, elegant without being ostentatious, beautiful without trying too hard to impress. When Rosalind first saw herself in the mirror wearing that gown, her hair dressed by Mrs. Blackwood's own skilled hands, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. This poised creature who looked like she belonged in a duke's ballroom rather than hiding in an abandoned cottage. The evening of the winter ball arrived with clear skies and bitter cold, the kind of December night when the stars seemed close enough to touch and every breath formed clouds of frost. Carriages began arriving at Ravenmore Hall as dusk fell, disgorging lords and ladies in their finest evening attire, the cream of county society, gathering for an event that had been anticipated for months as the social highlight of the season. Julian stood in the receiving line greeting his guests with perfect aristocratic courtesy, revealing nothing of the nervousness that churned beneath his calm exterior, while upstairs in her borrowed chamber, Rosalind prepared for the most important entrance of her life. She could hear the music starting in the ballroom, the murmur of hundreds of voices, the clink of crystal and the rustle of silk, and she had to grip the edge of her dressing table to steady herself as panic threatened to overwhelm her. This was madness, she thought wildly. Absolute madness to imagine that these people would accept her, that Julian's reputation could survive the scandal of claiming a nobody as his bride, that love could truly conquer the rigid hierarchies of their world. But then Julian himself appeared at her door, resplendent in black evening clothes that emphasized his broad shoulders and aristocratic bearing, and the look in his eyes when he saw her drove every doubt from her mind. He crossed the room and took both her hands in his, bringing them to his lips in a gesture that was equal parts reverence and possession, and told her with absolute conviction that she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, and that he was honored beyond measure that she had agreed to stand beside him. He reminded her that no matter what happened in the ballroom below, no matter how society reacted to his announcement, he would not waver in his choice, because she had shown him what true worth looked like, and he would spend the rest of his life proving that he understood the gift he had been given. Then he offered his arm, and together they descended the grand staircase toward the ballroom, where 300 members of the aristocracy waited, completely unaware that the Duke of Ravenmore was about to commit social suicide for love, and that they were about to witness either the most romantic gesture or the most catastrophic scandal of the decade. The ballroom fell silent as Julian and Rosalind appeared at the top of the stairs, not the gradual quieting of conversation that normally accompanied a host's entrance, but an abrupt cessation of sound, as 300 pairs of eyes fixed on the unknown woman in sapphire silk, standing beside the Duke of Ravenmore, with her hand resting on his arm as though she belonged there. The silence stretched and deepened, becoming almost physical in its weight, and Rosalind could feel the pressure of all those stares assessing her, judging her, finding her wanting. She recognized several faces from her previous life, society matrons who had attended her uncle's dinner parties and ignored her completely, young ladies who had been her peers before her parents' death reduced her to poverty and irrelevance, and she saw in their expressions a mixture of shock, confusion and dawning scandalized delight as they realized that the Duke's mysterious companion was nobody they recognized, which meant she was nobody, till Julian's hand covered hers where it rested on his arm, a gentle pressure of reassurance, and then he began their descent, moving with the unhurried confidence of a man who knew that every eye in the room would follow his lead, because that was what power meant in their world. They reached the ballroom floor and Julian guided her through the crowd that parted before them like a sea before a ship, whispers erupting in their wake like foam. Rosalind kept her chin lifted and her expression serene, channeling every lesson in deportment her mother had taught her years ago, refusing to show the fear that made her heart race and her palms damp beneath her long gloves. She could hear fragments of the whispered speculation, questions about her identity and status, comments about the inappropriateness of the Duke appearing with an unknown woman, suggestions that perhaps she was a distant relative or a widow from another county. But there was an edge of cruelty beneath the curiosity, an eagerness for scandal that reminded her exactly how vicious society could be when it sensed vulnerability, and she understood that these people would tear her apart with words if Julian gave them the slightest excuse to do so. They reached the center of the ballroom where the orchestra had fallen silent, and Julian turned to face the assembled guests, still holding Rosalind's hand in his, and in that moment she saw him transform from the private man she had come to love into the Duke of Ravenmore in all his formidable authority. His voice when he spoke carried clearly across the ballroom, pitched with the perfect aristocratic modulation that commanded attention without requiring him to raise his volume, and every word fell into the silence like a stone into still water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond this room. He thanked his guests for honoring him with their presence at Ravenmore Hall's winter ball, and then, with no preamble or softening of the blow, he announced that he had invited them here tonight not merely for celebration, but to share news of profound personal significance. He introduced Rosalind by her full name, Miss Rosalind Grey, and explained that she had been serving as governess to his daughter for the past 2 months, during which time he had come to recognize in her qualities that society too often overlooked in its obsession with fortune and family connections. He spoke of her intelligence, her kindness, her unwavering integrity, and her transformative effect on his daughter, who had been lost in grief until Miss Grey's arrival. And then, while the assembled aristocracy held its collective breath in anticipation of scandal, Julian did exactly what he had promised. He declared before them all that he intended to make Miss Rosalind Grey his duchess, that he was requesting the honor of her hand in marriage, and that he hoped his friends and peers would join him in celebrating a union based not on political advantage or financial gain, but on genuine respect, admiration, and love. The silence that followed this pronouncement was different from the curious hush that had greeted their entrance, deeper and more shocked, laden with disbelief and the beginning of outrage. Rosalind heard gasps from several corners of the room, saw faces contorting with disapproval and contempt, watched as society matrons clutched their fans and exchanged looks of horror that the Duke of Ravenmore, one of the most eligible men in England, would throw himself away on a governess of no family or fortune. But Julian seemed utterly unmoved by their reaction. His attention focused entirely on Rosalind as he turned to face her, still holding her hand, and asked in a voice meant only for her, though the entire ballroom strained to hear whether she would do him the honor of becoming his wife. It was theatre of the highest order, a public proposal that put her squarely at the center of attention and left her no room to retreat or demur, and Rosalind understood in that moment that this was Julian's way of protecting her, because once she accepted in front of 300 witnesses, once their engagement became public fact witnessed by the most powerful families in the county, no one, not even Lord Thornton, could tear her away from him. Without creating a scandal that would dwarf any gossip about her origins, the moment stretched as Rosalind looked up into Julian's eyes and saw there the absolute certainty of his choice, the love that had somehow grown from their unlikely beginning into something that could withstand society's judgment, and she felt something shift inside her, a final shedding of the shame and invisibility that had defined her existence since her parents' death. She thought of the girl who had fled through the forest in a torn wedding gown, terrified and alone, with no hope of rescue or redemption, and she thought of the woman she had become through Julian's faith in her worth, through Marianne's uncomplicated love, through the gradual recognition that her value was not determined by birth or fortune, but by the person she chose to be in the face of adversity. And so she answered him clearly, her voice carrying across the silent ballroom with a strength that surprised even herself, accepting his proposal with simple dignity that required no qualification or apology, claiming her place beside him as though she had been born to it, transforming herself in that moment from Miss Grey the governess into the future Duchess of Ravenmore, and daring anyone in that glittering assembly to suggest she was unwater. High of the position, the reaction to Rosalind's acceptance erupted like a dam breaking, a wave of shocked exclamations and scandalized whispers that rolled through the ballroom with physical force. Society matrons clutched their pearls and fanned themselves vigorously. Young ladies giggled behind their gloves at the audacity of it all, and the gentlemen exchanged looks that ranged from amused bewilderment to outright disapproval. But before the gossip could coalesce into open censure, before anyone could voice the objections that were clearly forming on a dozen aristocratic tongues, a commotion at the ballroom entrance cut through the chaos like a knife. Lord Percival Thornton stood framed in the doorway, his face flushed with rage and brandy, his evening clothes dishevelled as though he had dressed in haste, and his voice when he spoke carried the ugly authority of a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation and wealth. He announced to the assembled company that there had been a grave misunderstanding, that Miss Rosalind Grey was in fact his betrothed, legally contracted to marry him, and that she had run away from their wedding like a hysterical child who needed to be brought to heel. He demanded that the Duke release her immediately and allow her lawful husband-to-be to escort her home where she belonged. The ballroom fell into an even deeper silence, this one electric with anticipation of confrontation, as 300 guests collectively held their breath to see how the Duke of Ravenmore would respond to this extraordinary challenge to his authority in his own home. Rosalind felt Julian's hand tighten on hers, felt the coiled tension in his body like a predator preparing to strike. But when he spoke, his voice remained perfectly controlled, cold as winter ice and twice as cutting. He informed Lord Thornton that he was not a welcome guest at Ravenmore Hall, that his presence here was both presumptuous and offensive, and that the lady in question had made her choice freely and without coercion, which was more than could be said for the marriage contract Thornton was attempting to enforce. Julian then did something that made Rosalind's breath catch and sent ripples of shock through the assembled aristocracy. He publicly accused Lord Thornton of attempting to force an unwilling woman into marriage, of using legal machinations to trap a vulnerable young lady with no family to protect her, and of having a history with his previous wives that warranted investigation by the authorities. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fired pistol, and Lord Thornton's face went from flushed to purple with apoplectic rage. He sputtered denials and threats, insisting that his previous wives' deaths had been tragic accidents, that Miss Grey had been willing enough when her uncle signed the contract, that the Duke had no right to interfere in matters that did not concern him. But Julian was prepared for this, had in fact been counting on Thornton's inability to control his temper in public, and with a gesture to his butler, he produced the documentation his investigators had compiled over the past 3 weeks. The evidence was damning. Witness statements from servants describing Thornton's violent temper and his first wife's terror in the months before her fatal fall. Medical records suggesting his second wife's mysterious illness bore the hallmarks of slow poisoning. Testimony from the rector, who had performed Rosalind's marriage ceremony, describing how she had been locked in her room until the wedding and had appeared at the church with bruises on H. Jurists. Julian presented these findings not as gossip or rumor, but as documented fact, and he did so in a voice that made clear he was willing to pursue legal action if Thornton did not withdraw his claim immediately and permanently. The effect on the assembled guests was extraordinary. A collective gasp of horror as they realized they were witnessing not merely a romantic scandal, but the exposure of a potentially murderous predator who had been moving through their society unchallenged for years. The same matrons who had been prepared to condemn Rosalind for her presumption now looked at her with dawning sympathy, understanding that she had not been a runaway bride acting from caprice, but a desperate woman fleeing for her life. The gentleman who had been ready to support Thornton's claim out of respect for marriage contracts and male authority now stepped away from him as though he carried a contagious disease, unwilling to associate themselves with a man publicly accused of such heinous acts. Lord Thornton found himself suddenly isolated in a circle of empty floor, the crowd drawing back from him instinctively, and he seemed to realize in that moment that he had lost not just his claim to Rosalind, but his entire standing in society, that Julian's strategic exposure had destroyed him as effectively as any legal proceeding could have done. But Julian was not finished, because exposure alone was not enough to ensure Rosalind's safety, or to make his point to the society that had allowed men like Thornton to operate unchecked for so long. He addressed the ballroom at large, speaking directly to the peers and matrons who shaped opinion and determined what was acceptable in their world, and he challenged them to consider what their silence and complicity had enabled. He pointed out that Rosalind had been forced to flee and hide because no one in her family or social circle had been willing to protect her from a dangerous man. That society's obsession with wealth and status had made her vulnerable to predation, and that if this could happen to one woman, it was happening to countless others who lacked even the desperate courage she had shown in running away. He declared that as Duke of Ravenmore, he would no longer tolerate or ignore such abuses, that he would use his influence to support legal reforms, protecting women from forced marriages and investigating suspicious deaths, and that he expected every person in this ballroom who considered themselves honorable to join him in this cause. It was a masterful piece of rhetoric that transformed the evening from a personal scandal into a moral crusade, that reframed his choice of bride from social rebellion into ethical leadership, and that left his guests with no choice but to applaud his nobility of purpose or reveal themselves as complicit in the very abuses he was condemning. The applause that followed Julian's speech started slowly, hesitantly, with a few brave souls who recognized the political wisdom of aligning themselves with the Duke's moral position. But it built gradually into a thunderous ovation that filled the ballroom and sealed Lord Thornton's fate. The man stood frozen in his circle of isolation, his face contorted with impotent rage, understanding that he had been outmaneuvered completely and that any further protest would only deepen his disgrace. He turned and fled the ballroom without another word, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor, and no one moved to stop him or follow him because he had become in that moment exactly what Julian had intended, a cautionary tale, a symbol of everything society needed to reject if it wished to consider itself civilized. The guests watched him go with a mixture of relief and uncomfortable self-reflection, many of them surely wondering how many other Lord Thorntons moved through their circles unchallenged, how many other desperate women had no Duke of Ravenmore to rescue them, and whether their own comfortable silence made them complicit in horrors they preferred not to acknowledge. In the wake of Thornton's departure, the mood in the ballroom shifted dramatically, transforming from scandalized shock into something approaching celebration as society collectively decided to embrace the narrative Julian had provided them. The Duke of Ravenmore was not making a disastrous mésalliance, but rather demonstrating admirable moral courage by elevating a woman of true worth over empty pedigree, and anyone who questioned his choice was by implication siding with the disgraced Lord Thornton and everything he represented. It was a masterclass in social manipulation, and Rosalind watched it unfold with a mixture of awe and gratitude, understanding that Julian had not merely defended her, but had rewritten the entire story so that her presence at his side became evidence of his virtue rather than his weakness. The matrons who had gasped in horror at the announcement now approached to offer congratulations. The young ladies who had giggled now looked at Rosalind with something approaching envy, and the gentlemen who had frowned now praised Julian's discernment in recognizing quality regardless of circumstances. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of introductions and well wishes as guest after guest came forward to meet the future Duchess of Ravenmore and to secure their place on the right side of this social transformation. Rosalind played her part perfectly, gracious without being obsequious, dignified without being cold, allowing people to see in her exactly what Julian had described, a woman of intelligence and character who had been tested by adversity and emerged stronger for it. She danced the first waltz with Julian, and as they moved together across the floor with 300 pairs of eyes watching their every step, she felt the last vestiges of shame and fear fall away like a discarded cloak. She was no longer the invisible orphan or the desperate fugitive or the governess existing on the margins of society. She was Rosalind Grey, the woman whom Julian Ashcroft, Duke of Ravenmore, had chosen to share his life and his title, and that choice had transformed her not by erasing who she had been, but by validating that the person she had always been was worthy of love and respect. The evening's final triumph came near midnight, when the orchestra paused between dances and Julian called for attention once more. He announced that the banns for their marriage would be read starting the following Sunday, that the wedding would take place in 6 weeks at Ravenmore Chapel, and that every person present was invited to witness the ceremony and celebrate afterward at a wedding breakfast that would honor not just their union but the values of compassion and justice that he hoped would define his Duchess's tenure. It was a bold declaration that left no room for anyone to question the legitimacy or permanence of his intentions, and it prompted another round of applause and toasts to the happy couple. As champagne flowed and the dancing resumed, Rosalind caught glimpses of herself in the ballroom's mirrors, seeing reflected there not the frightened girl who had hidden in a gamekeeper's cottage, but a woman who belonged in these gilded halls, who had earned her place not through birth or fortune, but through the qualities Julian had recognized in her from the beginning. When the last guests had finally departed in the early hours of morning, and the ballroom stood empty, except for servants clearing crystal and extinguishing candles, Julian walked Rosalind through the quiet halls of Ravenmore Hall to the private family wing where she would now reside not as a governess, but as his intended bride. They paused outside her chambers, both exhausted from the emotional intensity of the evening, yet too energized to feel the lateness of the hour, and Julian took both her hands in his with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. He told her that watching her walk through that ballroom with her head high and her dignity intact, facing down the judgment of people who had no right to judge her, had been the proudest moment of his life, and that he had meant every word he had spoken about her worth and character. He confessed that he had entered this evening with strategic calculation, planning his words and timing his revelations for maximum effect, but that somewhere in the middle of defending her, he had stopped performing and started speaking from his heart, that his speech had transformed from manipulation into truth, because she had taught him what it meant to value substance over appearance and courage over comfort. He promised that their marriage would be a partnership of equals, that he would spend his life ensuring she never felt invisible or undervalued again, and that together they would build a family where Marianne would learn from her stepmother's example that a woman's worth was determined by her character and not by the circumstances of her birth. The wedding that took place 6 weeks later in the ancient stone chapel of Ravenmore was attended by every family of consequence in 3 counties, and the ceremony itself became the stuff of legend, a romantic story that would be retold in drawing rooms for decades to come. Rosalind walked down the aisle not on the arm of an uncle who had betrayed her, but escorted by the elderly Earl of Winchester, Julian's godfather, who had declared loudly, and to anyone who would listen, that Miss Grey possessed more true nobility in her smallest finger than most of the aristocracy could claim in their entire pedigree. She wore a gown of ivory silk, embroidered with silver threads that caught the winter sunlight streaming through the chapel's stained glass windows, and on her head sat a tiara that had belonged to Julian's grandmother, a duchess renowned for her charitable works and progressive views on women's education. When Julian turned to see her approaching, the expression on his face was one of unguarded love and wonder that made even the most cynical guests reach for their handkerchiefs, and when they exchanged their vows, his voice carried absolute conviction that this was not a marriage of convenience or strategy, but a union of two souls who had found in each other exactly what they needed to become whole. The years that followed validated every promise Julian had made that night in the ballroom, and exceeded even Rosalind's most hopeful imaginings of what happiness could look like. As the Duchess of Ravenmore, she threw herself into the role with passionate dedication, using her position to champion causes that society had long ignored, reforming laws around marriage contracts to protect vulnerable women, establishing schools for girls whose families could not afford governesses, creating safe houses for women fleeing dangerous situations. She became known throughout England not merely as the Duke's unlikely choice, but as a force for social change in her own right, a woman whose humble origins gave her credibility with those she sought to help, and whose aristocratic position gave her the power to effect real transformation. Julian supported her work completely, using his political influence to push through legislative reforms and his fortune to fund her charitable initiatives, and together they became a formidable partnership that reshaped their corner of English society in fundamental ways. Marianne thrived under Rosalind's loving guidance, growing from a grieving, silent child into a confident young woman who would eventually scandalize society in her own right by choosing to study medicine rather than make a conventional debut, a choice her parents supported wholeheartedly. The nursery at Ravenmore Hall filled with additional children over the years, 3 more in total, each one raised with the understanding that titles and wealth were privileges that carried responsibilities, and that true worth was measured in character and compassion rather than birthright. The family became known for their unconventional views and their happiness, for the laughter that filled halls once silent with grief, for the way the Duke and Duchess still looked at each other after 20 years of marriage with the same wonder and love that had marked their extraordinary beginning. Rosalind never forgot the terror of running through the forest, or the shame of being considered worthless by those who should have protected her, and those memories fueled her determination to ensure that other women would have options she had lacked, that vulnerability would not equal helplessness, and that society would learn to value people for who they were rather than what they possessed. When Rosalind's uncle died years later, leaving nothing but debts and regrets, she attended his funeral not out of familial obligation, but as an act of forgiveness for the desperate, frightened man who had sold her to settle his gambling losses because he could see no other way forward. She ensured his debts were paid and that he was buried with dignity, not because he deserved her mercy, but because she had learned that holding on to bitterness only poisoned the person carrying it, and she had too much joy in her life to waste energy on resentment. Lord Thornton's end came far less peacefully, his reputation destroyed and his fortune depleted by legal battles, dying alone and unmourned, a cautionary tale about the consequences of cruelty and the dangers of assuming that power and wealth placed one above moral law. The contrast between these two endings, between the lives that had tried to control Rosalind's destiny and the beautiful existence she had built through courage and Julian's love, was not lost on anyone who knew their story, and it became a parable about the ultimate triumph of integrity over expedience and love over fear. And so, dear listener, if you find yourself in circumstances that seem impossible, if you feel invisible or undervalued or trapped by expectations that diminish rather than celebrate your true worth, remember Rosalind Grey, who ran through the forest in a torn wedding gown with nothing but hope and courage, and who found in her darkest moment not an ending but a beginning. Remember that your value is not determined by those who cannot see it, that running toward an uncertain future can be braver than accepting a certain misery, and that sometimes the most unlikely love stories become the most enduring because they are built on recognition of real worth rather than superficial attraction. The world may tell you that security matters more than happiness, that accepting what is offered is wiser than risking everything for what might be. But Rosalind's story reminds us that the greatest adventures and deepest joys come from having the courage to believe that you deserve more than merely surviving, that you deserve to truly live, and that somewhere in this world there is someone who will recognize your value even when society has decayed. Laird you worthless. Hold on to your dignity, trust in your inner strength, and never let anyone convince you that circumstances of birth or fortune define your worth, because the most important validation comes not from titles or wealth, but from the knowledge that you faced your fears with courage and chose hope over despair, and that in itself makes you nobility of the truest kind.